Well, good evening. It's a privilege to be here this evening. I come from a country where some 38% of the labor force is unemployed or underemployed, where some 8 million people live in shacks, which we politely call informal settlements, and where some 50% of the population live in poverty. The most important socio-economic concern for the country is jobs, jobs, and jobs, and higher economic growth. Now, if one starts the conversation about business and development with negative presumptions and faulty ideas, one ends up with more and more rules about how business should behave in developing countries. On the other hand, if one starts with a positive approach to business and an appreciation of the risk-taking and precarious nature of companies, this leads to a focus on creating an environment in which competitive enterprises can flourish and help build the wealth and social capital that makes nations great. In poorer countries, the real problem is not that companies are unethical, but that there are too few of them. Now, we take the benefits of market economics, of capitalism, so much for granted that often we don't even understand or appreciate it most of the time. Of course, this is not a perfect system, and we're living through part of its imperfection at the moment. But then you have to ask yourself, what is the alternative? Now, how we describe reality, and therefore what we do about it, has real consequences. Let me give you just one example. I like this quote from a very prominent Indian government official a few years ago. He said, "We got a lot more done for the poor by pursuing the competition agenda for a few years than we ever got done by pursuing a poverty agenda for decades." So the battle of ideas really matters. And the battle of ideas about business and the good society, or business and development, is of great importance in my country and in many countries across the globe. I've been involved in this battle for all of my professional life. In apartheid South Africa, I worked for the country's largest NGO funded by business, the Urban Foundation, and we used the resources and power and influence of companies to help get rid of one of the cornerstones of apartheid, the influx control system. In the 1990s, I was called as an expert witness at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings on business. A week of hearings examining what business did or didn't do under apartheid, what it might have done. And this was obviously a very important question, but was conducted in a way that offended some people, rather simplistic and moralistic approach. And I was struck by a question from a very senior businessman. On the fourth day, got rather irritated, and he said, "Okay, let's stop pussyfooting around here. Would you rather that Sir Ernest Oppenheimer had never come to South Africa and gone on to develop Australia instead?" For those of you who don't know, Ernest Oppenheimer founded the Anglo-American Corporation, at that time the largest company in Africa, and also the De Beers Company. They owned many other companies as well in South Africa then. A pretty fundamental question, I think, one that the Truth Commission was not set up to answer. The morning of my evidence, I was struck by a radio announcement. Nelson Mandela, the President of South Africa, global human rights icon, and rightly so around the world, was in China. And from the steps of the Forbidden City, what did he say? He called on South African business to invest in China. Well, I thought that was an interesting issue that the Truth Commission should deal with. The tough question of companies in, if you like, less than perfect societies. But they didn't want to deal with that either. The third experience that influenced me was a few years ago. I had an opportunity to spend time in Washington. And it soon became clear to me that a good company was one that complied with the ideas and standards, labor, environment, and social issues, devised by activists and governments in the world's richest countries on how to behave in poorer countries. And you can participate in conversations in Brussels, Washington, New York, and I'm sure in London. It's totally taken for granted that global standards are a good thing. Well, no one wanted to listen to who were opposed to global standards. Nobel laureate Paul Krugman and a number of other people have argued it this way. The alternative to low-paying jobs is not high-paying jobs, but no jobs at all. And South Africa is a perfect case of that. Now, all of these experiences led me to write this book and to try and construct a developing country perspective on business and its role in society. I'm going to try this evening to give you a taste of some of the key issues in my book, and I will mainly deal with just doing business and what impact that has. And then I will say a few words about international campaigns, about global poverty and how companies should get involved in this. And then lastly we'll end with what I call protecting my back, just to make sure there are fewer misunderstandings than I would like. Let me start then with talking about so-called just doing business. Companies are continually being pressurized to do more, to demonstrate what benefit they provide society in addition to just doing business. It's as though profit-making entities need to redeem themselves through good works, pay reparations for their existence, and this then leads to the development of what the economist has called the corporate social responsibility industry. I call it a movement. It's both. The current conversation about business is fundamentally flawed. The debate about responsible corporations takes for granted the everyday activities of companies and their overwhelmingly positive contribution to society. And it's this that makes it possible to focus so much attention on what else a company must do to contribute to the social good. Business leaders and their companies have mostly responded to the attacks on profit-making as a respectable contribution to society by what I think you can only call intellectual collapse. In almost all cases, business leaders have given in without much of a struggle and accepted the general charge that companies need to do much more than just business in order to contribute to society. And instead of boldly and persuasively making the case for business, we have seen a process of appeasement. In fact, the conversation about business and society is out of kilter, and we need to restore the balance. Now, I'm happy to have a conversation about business and what it should and can do in society, but I want that conversation to start by looking at the positive benefits that successful modern business contribute to the societies in which they operate. Now, normal company activities have direct and indirect impact. The direct impact is more familiar. Modern business is the most powerful engine ever invented of innovation, large-scale organization, and transmission of know-how across frontiers. That's in addition to those minor things like creating wealth, jobs, paying taxes that all of us depend upon. The limited liability corporation has been described as the greatest single invention of modern times. It is the mechanism through which companies increase the pool of capital available for productive investment. It allows investors to spread their risk by purchasing small, easily marketable shares in several enterprises. It provides a way of imposing effective management structures on large organizations. And it has the capacity to fail with relatively low social costs. And it's through this mechanism that companies can finance and manage their large-scale operations. Companies are uniquely effective in making human effort productive. Specialized resources in the form of labor, raw and finished materials, capital and knowledge come together in a remarkable process that transforms these components into goods and services of greater value. In so doing, they make a revolutionary contribution to the world in which we all live. Now, Henry Ford's $5 wage to his workers was a force for good, but his cheap cars helped revolutionize and change the lives of the poor in ways that socialists could only dream about. Unilever's CEO, or former CEO, put it this way: the very business of doing business has a huge impact on society. 3/4 of our sales revenue goes straight out, again, to pay for goods and services for suppliers. Of the wealth we create each year, by adding value to those goods and services, around 70% of it is channeled back into society through employee wages, shareholder dividends, government taxes, community investment. Unilever generates employment. For every job they create, every job we create in Unilever, we indirectly create several more in our supply chains and distribution channels. Private enterprise is also an important source of less tangible but vital factors, such as openness to ideas, innovation, of course, opportunity, and empowerment. When dynamic private enterprises are allowed to flourish, they tap into people's initiative, their ingenuity, their self-reliance. When people can participate in an economy by creating or joining an enterprise, they gain voice. Now, all of these benefits are created in the normal course of responding to the market. So modern business then has direct impacts on countries and communities. In addition to that, it has indirect impact, predominantly positive, on the countries in which it operates. I've called this invisible corporate citizenship, which is not generally discussed in boardrooms, but it's the inadvertent consequences of just doing business. And it can profoundly alter the future direction and prospects of a nation. Let me go into this and give you some examples. I was struck by a journalist who looked at China and what she said about that process that's been going on now for the last 25 years. She said it wasn't just jobs the Chinese were after, it was modernization itself. When foreign companies sought to open factories in China, the government insisted that they use and teach Chinese workers how to use their latest techniques, flooding a technologically antiquated country with know-how and spurring a speedy transfer, latter-day industrial revolution. But it's more than just technology. An American professor went around China and he went into some company headquarters and factories. And he went into a Motorola factory. So here we have this modern enclave in Chinese society. And what did he see on the walls? But big posters saying, "Speak out, your views matter. We want to know what you think." Very different set of ideas and values than in the society as a whole. That's more than that. Modern business, generally, it's obviously not perfect, but operates as a meritocracy. Individuals matter. Careers, you talk about. People share information. Reason and facts matter. Modern recruitment methods, not really very interested which clan you come from or which tribe. They're interested in skilled people or unskilled people. They're interested in labor. They break through a whole lot of old ideas and ways of doing things. One of the most interesting examples comes from South Africa, where under apartheid, companies recognized black trade unions actually before they had to do this legally. But in the company, you started to get in the workplace white managers negotiating with black trade unions, and increasingly on a basis of more and more equality as the two sides recognized the power that either side had. You got, in a sense, a kind of zone of liberation different from what was going on in the rest of the society. Business can function then in a certain way as an independent space from the state. Very important in helping to promote pluralism. Let me give you another example of the indirect impact of companies. I used to only have one, but now I have more than that. We asked somebody to look at the impact of a listing on the Shanghai Stock Exchange of a modern corporation. And his findings were revealing. Large multinationals need certainty in order to invest, and providing this requires rules and standards. So a company pushes for effective property laws and laws governing contracts. Rules and standards require the means to create, monitor, and maintain them. And this in turn requires institutions and associations, independent professionals, reasonably independent judiciary, and reasonably reliable information, some form of media. So normal business activity, not because it intends to, but because of what it needs, requires and creates a complex web of organizations and institutions and self-regulating mechanisms, processes of some transparency and openness, professionals and their organizations. Business, through doing business, strengthens civil society. I always use that example, and then I met someone recently who had studied the role of those radical social change agents, accountants and lawyers, who were representing multinational companies going into former Eastern Europe. And his experience mirrored that of reported from China. That when the multinational said, gee, this is interesting, I think we'll move into one of these countries, they had sent their lawyers to find out what are the property rights, what are the rules of the game here. And in the process, the lawyers would talk to government and others and say, well, if you want multinational X to come, we need the following kinds of certainties. And so indirectly, they started to contribute to the rule of law and the development of modern institutions in those societies. My three favorite examples, though, come from three companies. The first is Infosys, the IT pioneer out of Bangalore, India. And Nandan Nilekani was the CEO of this, and he was asked a few years ago, Mr. Nilekani, what is your greatest achievement? And he said this. He said, well, we've created a multi-billion-dollar company, and I'm pretty proud of that. But I think our greatest achievement is that we've redefined the possible for India. And if you think about how we used to think about India and how Indians and other people think about it now, that's a pretty profound insight and contribution that a number of companies have made. But think about Toyota. They're getting a bad rap at the moment, or lately. But according to the McKinsey Global Institute, Toyota was the company that pioneered the development of high productivity, high quality manufacturing practices, and these in turn transformed global industry. Hundreds of firms now work towards a standard established by Toyota, thus elevating global productivity levels, which in turn elevated the overall level of wealth and well-being around the globe. My third company example is Walmart. Now, Walmart's critics allege the retailer is bad for the poor, but this claim is in fact backward if you look at America. Walmart's discounting on food alone boosts the welfare of American shoppers by at least $50 billion a year. The savings are possibly 5 times that much if you count all of their products. Their everyday low prices make the biggest difference to the poor, since they spend a higher proportion of their income on food and other basics. As a force of poverty relief, Walmart's $200 billion plus assistance to consumers may rival many federal programs. Walmart has been credited with reducing inflation in communities and nationally. Not a bad contribution, just doing business. My last example then is about women, and women in Asia, in those so-called sweatshops. Now, multinationals are often accused of interfering with traditional practices, and this is one particular practice that they have interfered with, the subjugation of women. The factories in China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and elsewhere, where people work under horrible conditions, often long hours, a job I certainly want, generally represent the very best options that they can get. Now, it turns out that a disproportionate number of these workers are women. They're often people coming from the rural areas who come to town, and this is the best job going. They don't last in these jobs all that long. They're hard, and they affect your eyesight sometimes, but they generally work there 5 to 7 years. And the evidence is that people report that they save their money. They often start little businesses servicing other workers, and then afterwards they stay in town and become an entrepreneur, or they go back to the rural areas where they are no longer under the control of their father, their husband, or their brother, but they have some power of their own. This story is really one of a silent revolution of social change that affects how these women think about their children, particularly their girl children, and their desire for education for those children. And this story is being played out in South Africa today in a most tragic and interesting way. There is a town called Newcastle in KwaZulu-Natal. It's a small town. It has an unemployment rate close to 80% in the town and the surrounding rural areas. And they had an innovative local official who went off to China, and he got some Chinese entrepreneurs to come and start garment factories. And about 2 months ago, we read in the newspapers that the trade union had complained about this because some of these factories were paying less than minimum wages, and the inspectors had arrived to close the factories down. And the reporter for the New York Times story I read, reporters said, the women in the factories jumped on the tables shouting at the inspectors to go away because they wanted these jobs. She interviewed one woman who said she used to be a domestic servant who used to work from 6 in the morning to 9 at night. And after that family moved away, she went to work at a garment factory where she said she was treated with respect, the hours were shorter, the pay was better. She started a small business selling shoes to other workers. She saved enough money to buy a little house. So, let me sum up then about business and its indirect impact. Through the unintended consequences of its everyday activities, business can transform the future of national economies. Think Mauritius. And fuel the forces and dynamics of modernization, China, Vietnam, and elsewhere. Can expand and strengthen civil society through lawyers and accountants and through their needs, companies' needs. And can expand human rights and unleash, no guarantees, but unleash some pressures for democratization. And you think of apartheid South Africa, black trade unions, and negotiations with white companies. This is very different from the notion of business as a conservative force, working to preserve the status quo, or an essentially malign power which needs to pay a social penalty to offset the negative consequences of its pursuit of profit. Let me turn to another issue I deal with in the book, and very briefly, I thought I would raise some of these questions. I deal with international campaigns against global poverty and the role of business in those. There are a lot of them. I'm essentially arguing that if global poverty is the question, then corporate social responsibility is not the answer. I'm also arguing against seeing, for example, the Millennium Development Goals as the global standard for development. In many respects, it is the wrong place in which to start the conversation about development, and business and many governments should not sign on to this campaign. Let me explain why. The MDGs, which are 8 goals that look harmless enough, kind of motherhood-like, these are really outcomes of development. It's not all that much about how to achieve them, but that's where the real debate begins. You'll be pleased to know the private sector is mentioned in the documents backing up the Millennium Development Goals. They're mentioned twice in 2 footnotes. There is no mention of markets as a force that can be used, markets and entrepreneurs, to say provide health or schooling or training for people. So that's ignored. It's a kind of welfarist approach to development. My main point, though, is that the defining characteristic of developing countries, or most developing countries, is a lack of government capacity. And as anybody knows, you have to have priorities if you're going to get anything done. Now, if you were to ask any business operating, say, in Africa, what are the things that would make your life easier, that would make sort of business boom and economic development take off and so on and so forth? They would say infrastructure. They would talk about an enabling environment in which to do business, which would stun you with how unenabling it is in many places. And they would talk about good governance and the quality of the state. Now, you can't have those priorities and then add on all the Millennium Development Goals as well. You can't do all of it at once. You're going to have to make choices. If the Millennium Development Goal says the priority is primary schooling for everybody, well, where are you going to find some money for higher level schooling or universities so that our countries can compete with the rich countries? Now, I was pleased to see that Cabinet Minister Andrew Mitchell made an important speech saying that the private sector and business should be at the heart of development, and I couldn't agree more with him. But he then went on to talk about the Millennium Development Goals being at the center of British policy as well. And I think there are choices to be made. I don't think you can be pushing countries all over the world to achieve the Millennium Development Goals as though they were all the same and their priorities were all the same, and say we're going to have to put business at the heart of development, because what business needs in order to play its dynamic role are a few things that are rather different from what predominate in the Millennium Development Goals. So I'm really arguing that business leaders and governments shouldn't necessarily sign on to other people's agendas with such alacrity. And I am, in this whole area of global campaigns, as I've indicated, totally opposed to so-called global standards on labor, environment, and social issues. In many respects, the ongoing conversation about business and society is dominated by the perspectives and interests of activists who live in rich countries. Am I allowed to say formerly rich countries? Sorry. Most of these protagonists do not grasp the realities of poverty and the hard choices of development outside the rich world. As a result, the debate about business, responsibility, and corporate involvement in development is distorted, with few voices from developing countries being heard. And I'm really arguing that a new approach and a new discourse is required to cut through an increasingly flawed conversation with potentially dangerous consequences for the poor and for developing countries in general. Let me move to close then. What I've written then is a book in praise of enterprise and corporations. It is also a call on business leaders to stop apologizing and to stand up for competitive capitalism, and especially in developing countries. I wouldn't want you to be misled, though. I am not a business fundamentalist. I am not saying that the business of business is only business. Companies have a profound interest in the societies in which they operate, the quality of governance, how business is seen, education, health, and a whole lot of other things. I am not a business apologist. There are certainly bad companies, and business leaders should speak out about those. They shouldn't only always attack government for what it's doing. An example in my country, 2 years ago, some companies were found guilty of colluding against the competition laws so as to increase the price of bread to the poor. I think that's a good example where other corporate leaders should have spoken out in opposition to what was done there. I think states are important. A lot of the charges and demands of business are often issues that should be dealt with by effective government and good institutions. So states are very important, and I have a strong preference for democracy. And I am really calling on companies and business leaders and their organizations to play a much more thoughtful, strategic, and involved role in the societies in which they operate. And then lastly, I'm not arguing against corporate social investment. I am arguing, I have a whole chapter on this, for a much more strategic approach to how that very precious money is spent. So, Mr. Chairman, in my view, the past 50 years have seen smart states opening up their societies to more enterprise and more competition from local and foreign firms. And the result has been a phenomenal dynamic. We have seen more people move out of poverty than ever before, and they have done this more quickly than we have ever seen. I think governments and business leaders should recognize the importance of the battle of ideas about economic development and the role of business, and that one of the big challenges is how to change the conversation. Business is good for society, it's essential for sustained development. How can companies become more effective at making this case? We do know they should stop apologizing for their existence. They should stand up for what they do every day, and that the facts are on their side. Thanks very much.